Hi, good morning, good afternoon, or I think those are the two, to everyone. On behalf of the Resilience Learning Activity and the Secretariat for the Partnership for Resiliency and Economic Growth, we're very excited to have you on the call as RMS continues to go through their survey results to inform future resiliency efforts. That RLA looks to work with USAID and USAID partners in terms of this co-creation and localization strategy to increase resilience across the PREG counties. We're excited to have you here today. We look forward to more joining in, and for questions, please include those in the chats, and look forward to hearing from the team in terms of the findings that they have as we go into these round 3 results. Thank you very much. Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Jim. Hello, everyone. Yeah, this is Mark Langworthy from Tango, and yes, we are happy to be presenting the findings from the 3rd round of the RMS, the 2nd RMS under PREG 2. Next slide, please.
Oh, having said that, hang on. Oh, next slide.
Next slide. Yeah. So just to sort of a bit of background to get everyone in the frame of mind here. So this is the 2nd RMS that's under the PREG 2 learning activity, I guess. And this is a follow-on from a baseline that was done for PREG 2 in 2018. There was a first year of RMS, which was done from September 2019 to June 2020. We are now presenting the results from the 3rd round of the 2nd RMS. And then the plan is that there will be an end line to finish up this PREG 2 study next year. And again, just as an overview of what this RMS, the Recurrent Monitoring System, is all about. It's a data collection activity, which is done on a short intervals to collect close to real-time information, 3-month intervals. And in these in the surveys, we collect information from the respondents about their exposure to shocks, and how severe the shocks were from their perception, the extent to which they've recovered. We also measure information about food security outcomes, the kinds of coping strategies that the households have adopted. We measure in the RMS, get information about some of the key elements of resilience capacities that we think are likely to change over a short period of time, and also may be affected by programming interventions. We also collect information about the household's exposure to and participation in different kinds of PREG interventions. And the overall analysis that will be conducted, the fuller analysis will be conducted when we have the complete 4 rounds of information. But essentially the purpose will be to look at how the level of household resilience capacities have affected how influenced households' ability to recover from shocks that they're exposed to, and perhaps more importantly even is to look at how PREG and other resilience interventions have contributed to enhancing the resilience capacities and the outcomes of households in the project implementation area. Next slide, please. Just to give you a sort of a brief overview of the findings that coming out of this round, or sorry, out of the previous round. So food insecurity was remained high, as had been seen in the 1st round. There's the food security conditions were such that a large share of the households in the sample were in need of humanitarian assistance. There's ongoing exposure to drought, the severe drought, and higher prices continue to be the main shocks. You know, as a bit of background, the high prices are in part caused by the Ukraine crisis and the shortages of international grains, which increased local food prices. But then also the shortages in terms of inputs for farmers continue to be reported in this round. Emergency assistance increased in round 2 compared to round 1, but was still relatively low. And then cash transfers were operating primarily as part of sort of targeted safety net programs. Next slide, please. So what we're going to be doing in the presentation today is to, while we've sort of talked a bit about the overview of the RMS, we're going to present descriptive findings from round 3. We're going to present data about household participation in resilience programming. And we're going to, at various points in the presentation, we're going to stop that to open it up for questions. And the 3 questions we'd sort of like you to keep in mind as we're going through the presentation is, number 1, for all of you that are more familiar with the reality on the ground in the PREG implementation areas, are these results sort of consistent with your understanding of what's happening on the ground? Does the information about program participation seem accurate to you? And then if you have any sort of explanation about sort of the context that maybe can help to understand the reasons behind the patterns that we're seeing in these results. Next slide, please. So we'll briefly talk about the methodology of the RMS, and then we'll get into presenting findings around food security, shocks, and coping strategies and recovery. And we'll have a pause for Q&A session. Then we'll look at the resilience capacities, particularly the ones that we're tracking more closely in the RMS, particularly livestock and social capital components. Again, we'll stop for a Q&A session. Next slide. Okay, with that, I will turn it over to Stephanie to dive into the methodology and the findings. Thanks. Over.
Stephanie, you're on mute.
You're on mute.
Thank you. Let me make sure. Okay, now I'm good. My name is Stephanie Martin. I'm an analyst at Tango. I've been working on these PREG and REGO projects for quite some time. The outline of this presentation today follows the outline of the previous 2 RMS presentations, where we talk about shocks and coping strategies and recovery, and then we talk about resilience capacities, and then at the end we talk about program participation. I'd like to shift the emphasis a little today and focus on the participation piece and if possible, to get feedback from people who are closer to it than I am, so that we make sure going into the 4th and final round that we have the questions right and we're measuring accurately and extensively enough. So I've allocated more time to that. We started out this study, this PREG impact evaluation started out in a baseline in 2018 with about 2,800 households. It's a panel study, which means that the same households are studied over time. So we can look at within household change, and we can do more sophisticated analysis and approximate close to causal findings in the end for it's a good, strong non-experimental design. There were 2 RMSs as part of the PREG IE. This is the second of the 2. Usually at Tango, or usually the RMS process is to have the surveys triggered by a shock. In this case, the drought was well underway when the RMS 2 started. We were already, or Northern Kenya was already into 4 failed rainy seasons. PREG programming had been in place for 3 years. That had been suspended during COVID, but was getting re-implemented. This sample is about 800 households selected from the baseline. So, and we're collecting close to real-time data about how they're faring. We wanted to recognize the American Institute for Research for doing their great field work, both quantitative and qualitative, as well as the PREG baseline. They came up against conflict and had to be logistically very sophisticated to get their teams in and out and get the job done. So the qualitative sample, this is a mixed method study where we have a quantitative survey and then a qualitative survey going into close to the same areas to try and both explain the quantitative results and to sort of guide these ongoing research questions. We chose a selection of sites that were in the quantitative sample and then alternated whether we did key informant interviews or focus groups. We staggered the focus groups so that we would minimize respondent burden and to be careful with the budget. The findings are, as everyone knows, pretty grim. This is an adaptation from the FuseNet calendar. It spans a long time. So to make it really clear that the conditions, the food security conditions that we're seeing now in northern Kenya didn't start with this drought, and that it's wedged in between massive global shocks and the resolve. I don't know that anyone knows. It's unclear, and conditions seem to be, at least our data indicate, worsening, which is hard to believe because they were already terrible. So the issues started with the COVID, when COVID came, and the shutdowns not only sent home people who were working in other countries, but shut down PREG and shut down livestock markets. That you can see was the COVID that ended in June of 2020, but the COVID effects continued past then, and then the subsequent supply chain issues and inflation issues were the legacy of COVID. Then the drought started at the end of 2020. All of 2021, the drought went on and on. The drought gets worse and worse. Then in February of 2022, we start these survey rounds. When we were going into the field, we were looking at the 4th failed rainy season. They're now in a 5th failed rainy season. Also during this time, right before the start of our first round, was the Ukraine crisis started. And because of African countries are a direct importer of wheat, there was no wheat. So all the prices of any wheat substitutes went sky high. And running along the side of these red boxes are things like locusts and just the ongoing shocks that would be in and of themselves plenty to deal with. This is the FuseNet, just for another illustration. That was the chart. This is the map. Nothing, no matter how you look at this problem, none of it looks good. It just shows that, stepping along through time, the food security problem has gotten worse and worse and worse. And because these are averages on the right-hand side, red means that, to get red, you have to have some higher than red and some lower than red. So there are some households in that who are at famine or very, very close to a famine stage. So the story, the bigger story is, how did we get from this on the left, which was start of this came off of a PREG, earlier PREG report, the picture on the left to the picture on the right, where all the livestock are dead. This is we've seen the map, we've seen the chart, and now we see the people. So we in our surveys, we measure 3 food security indicators. The first is the household dietary diversity score, which tells us what people are eating. It's a count of 12 food groups, and the recall is over the past 24 hours. In this graph on the left, you see that it initially increased from round 1 to round 2, and then steadily dropped after round 2. What it looks like behind the line in between, the far left is the baseline in 2018. So when you read these graphs, there is just sort of a longer gap between the first 2 date categories on the x-axis. But the increase between the baseline and round 1 shows in the actual data of what people ate, it looks like it's food relief that's coming in and maintaining the numbers, the counts of food people eat. There was a shift from meat and vegetables to grains and oils and sugars and condiments, the kind of things that come in food relief packages. That those numbers continued through round 2 and dropped in round 3. In round 3, we also heard from households that food relief had been delayed. So that information might tell the story behind this. The second measure that we use is called the Food Insecurity Experience Score, and it's a 30-day recall. And it asks 8 questions that range from ask households whether they're worried and concerned about food, thinking about food, to whether they sort of switched out things in their diet and they're eating things that are not their favorite foods or less nutritious foods, but are filling, to actually not eating. Keep in mind, in all of these graphs, that the baseline scores were relatively high for this area because it was a lean season survey. They're higher than usual and higher than they'd been in past surveys that we've done. That from there, they just continue to rise. So we're looking at, almost 90% of households experiencing food insecurity. And this is supported by our qualitative data that are estimating somewhere in the range of 90% of households are skipping meals. This is another measure, which is a more severe measure. It's gathered at the top of that scale and asks households whether they are actually skipping meals and going without food. It was not significantly changed in the beginning and then started to rise, and it's at 64% in the 3rd survey round. The 3rd survey round and the 1st survey round were both during lean season, but all seasons look pretty lean right now. Several qualitative interviewers came back with stories of people who had not eaten for several days, for 2 or 3 days. In the last round, in round 2 of the survey, there was a story of a man who had come into a work center looking for work and dropped dead on the floor for starvation. And there are studies of people just drinking hot water and then dying because they don't have any nutrition. So we're just moving. In the data that we see, it may have already happened, but our data are showing people it's moving from livestock deaths to human deaths. The other, I should go through shocks. One of the other measures we pick up is shocks. So we have an understanding of what's going on, what households are exposed to. We asked about 23 different shocks. Not surprisingly, the top 2 shocks are food prices and drought. And livestock disease. The livestock disease is down. A lot of it is because the livestock have died. We did not, in this number here, we did not just, the denominator is the entire sample, not just livestock owners. There's stories in every single survey round of herders who have migrated with their animals and come back with none. One in round 2 committed suicide, at least one. These are shocks. The next round, the next less like medium intense shocks. We can see that the inflation and the price shocks extend to food and fertilizer. People who farmed are having a hard time getting inputs. Input prices are really high. We see in this one that late assistance seems to be affecting food security. We saw that food aid is down, and a lot of sharp increase in households who are reporting that assistance is late. The job loss is up and down. There was some discussion after COVID that lots and lots of businesses closed and didn't reopen. So those people added to the unemployment. In these rounds, in rounds 2 and round 3, we're seeing that people are leaving, at least temporarily leaving crop production, leaving livestock production, and trying to make their way into some kind of petty trade or wage work. The human disease is down. Qualitative data indicate that's because the COVID piece is down. However, a lot of drought-related diseases are up, and we're seeing the qualitative reports are that malnutrition and nutrition-related diseases among children are way up. Surprisingly or not, nothing is particularly surprising. In Turkana, the flooding was devastating. That people who lived near the river reported that their houses were destroyed and their livestock were wiped out. The source of the flooding was not in Turkana. I'm sure someone in this room has the explanation for how that flooding happened, but it was devastating. I read too that it was in Lake Turkana, and as usual, often follows drought or big floods. So even though it looked like some of the shocks were down, and it looked like maybe, even though they were still really high, the 80 and 90%, high 80, 90% for drought and price shocks, the severity is up. We measure severity by asking households, what were the impacts on these are 2 separate questions. What were the impacts on your income? What were the impacts on your food? And it's a Likert scale, ranges from 0 to 4. It has not changed since round 1. It's still very high. What we're seeing is that the Likert scale is no longer adequate to measure these conditions, that a lot of households, they started out in the first RMS round saying it's as bad as it's ever been, and they're sort of pinned on that top that it doesn't go up enough. And so the data it's called censored data. The data are stacking up on that point. We need to rethink our scales, which is a depressing problem to have in statistics. We asked too about coping strategies and recovery. So these on the left, we have coping strategies that were reported by more than 20% of households. We asked something like 52 coping strategies. The key strategies were to reduce food intake and buy food on credit. These have been the same, pretty close to the same, not statistically different across the 3 RMS rounds. It may be that they've topped out, that this is as many households as could possibly reduce their food input. We also see that households have reduced non-food expenditures, continued to sell livestock. They're selling more livestock. They sold more livestock in round 3 than in round 2. Now, as households have resorted to absolute distress sales, just there's no food and they're selling really emaciated livestock. What we see is an increase, a pretty sharp increase in spiritual practices. Households have become more fatalistic and, less rely on structured remedies. New work continues. And the qualitative data indicated that people continue to leave livestock and leave agriculture. We track at Tango because they're important for food security and important for recovery and important for resilience. We track use of cash aid, use of food aid, role of remittances, and savings as used as coping strategies. They are all, until cash in round 3, they are all very, very low. So you see that at the bottom that very, very few households had savings going into this. Remittances increased a little over the rounds, but were probably low because everyone was sent home at COVID. Food aid is low. Food aid continues to look like it's a targeted receipt group, which is a safety net group. The data indicate that it's not being used as a humanitarian assistance program. Cash aid is up significantly in this round. It looks like we're starting to see cash aid moving. This is qualitative information about livestock. You can see on the right, there are maybe 4 goats in the livestock market. People are just qualitative. People who participated in the qualitative research reported that people are just selling whatever they have left. People who held on to their livestock as long as they possibly could are now selling it. They have, they need food, and it's clear the drought is not going to end. There was no reason, or there was no, didn't pay off to hang on to their livestock. Key informants confirm what we see in the quantitative data, that people continue to reduce meal frequency and the number of meals. That's mirrored in the hunger indicator, that people are just cutting out food. But there are stories of pastoralists migrating even further away. In round 2, they were migrating and coming back with no animals, either just continuing to go further away. Some people reports are that some people are coming in from urban areas hoping to find better conditions in rural areas, only to find that they're worse. There are migration looks like a very haphazard situation right now with no information. There are rural people migrating to rural hubs. There are urban people migrating to rural. There's rural to rural. People are moving around, but they're not coming out with anything better when they get to their destination. When livestock herds are mixing, the livestock are getting sick. It's not working as a coping strategy or a resilience strategy. In this picture, the camels are eating the fence. This is what has been reported happening in the migration, is that livestock go into villages and eat people's houses and fences, and then the communities are angry with the pastoralists, and that we're hearing reports of conflicts that were never, there were already conflicts in this area, but we're hearing reports of new kinds of conflicts, and conflicts between groups that you wouldn't think would be fighting. We also collect data on recovery from shocks, and both of these pretty much show that households have not recovered. We ask them, this is about the current shock. We ask them if they have recovered at all, partially recovered, fully recovered. I would guess for the livestock disease, they may have recovered because the livestock are dead. They're not having livestock disease anymore. The rest of the numbers, we can talk about human disease in a second. The rest of the numbers are no different, statistically different than zero. This is incredibly grim. It speaks to both the reality of recovery and people's outlook about their own recovery. Statistically, it's we can no longer estimate the probability of recovery because the variables don't vary enough. It's not, we don't have any real woes in the statistical world, but that's what's going to happen. The human disease recovery is because of the COVID, I think because of the COVID remission and a lot of lifting of the COVID restrictions. So we had some questions when we were looking through our data about, we have reports from the qualitative team that of a lot of conflict, of people being attacked on the way to markets, of livestock being held for ransom until the owners pay up by livestock, herds being flat out stolen. We have reports of we've sort of, it looks like entered maybe and crossed a lower threshold of behavior. We have stories of neighbors stealing from each other and people who say they can't even leave their laundry on the laundry line without, one of their neighbors taking it. But we don't see in our survey data are any households. We see very few households reporting any kind of conflict or theft or violence. And we're wondering why that is, and if there's a stigma or something. So too with the livestock data, it looks like we are seeing higher reports in the household survey about livestock ownership than the qualitative data indicate. We want to make sure, we want to be accurate, but we also want to make sure that if there is some sort of stigma or shame around these questions, that we get them right going into the fourth round so that we are not making life more traumatic and worse for people by, prodding them about things that are really difficult to talk about. The other question is about the cash distribution. What we saw in the data is that it seems to be centered in one county in Marsabit. We're not seeing it, we're definitely not seeing it across all 9 counties. And we're wondering how does the cash distribution work? And our development programs, as part of the above question, how are development programs moving to cash assistance, or is it running through the counties? And part of that too is why it's not more uniform across counties. So here I'd like to stop and take questions and comments. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. All right, so this is where you can use your Zoom reactions option to raise your hand and ask your question live. You can also put your questions in that Google Doc that the link is in the chat. And just give everyone a minute to absorb all of the information that Stephanie has just shared.
And I guess another question is, does anyone who's closer to this see any end in sight? Are there any success stories? Are there any places where the situation looks to be improving?
Hi, Stephanie. Thanks. Yeah, this is John Meyer from the Center for Resilience. I don't have anything for that last question you asked, but I was just curious about the recovery issue. Is it perhaps too early to expect much recovery given the crisis itself hasn't, I guess it's peaked perhaps, but it's not finished? And when in your experience, does should we expect some serious recovery to take place if it's going to take place? Thanks.
Oh, that's an interesting question. Yeah, I totally agree that we're in the thick of it. It's just a very long lasting thick of it. I think the recovery, this is my mostly opinion, but it's based on studies I've done in other areas. Once the drought ends is sort of the trigger point, but then it takes a long time for all the secondary shocks to resolve. You need to go through, if you think about it, even in terms of seasons, you have to go through an agricultural season, inputs need to come in and plants need to be planted and harvested, and that needs to play out for that sector to be getting towards recovery. Same with livestock need to be restocked and pasture needs to regrow. And so as there's sort of a rolled onset of shocks, there's a rolled ease of shocks. I think these are going to be particularly difficult because the damage is so pervasive. And the other point I wanted to make is that tied up in all this global inflation and global funding shortages, and mostly Ukraine related and COVID recovery, is that there's not the development people. The funding people can speak to this better than I can, but my sense is that there's just not enough funding. There's not even adequate normal funding running into Kenya, and there's definitely not enough funding now, and there's not enough global logistics to do everything that needs to happen in the Ukraine and in African countries, and everyone wants to recover from COVID, and we have the Ukraine. And my sense is that not only are the households hammered by this, but the humanitarian assistance is also hammered by that. And I don't know if the food delays are related to that, or if it's an internal Kenya issue. But I think it is going to be a very long process, unfortunately. I mean, if we think about it, we put in $7 trillion into our economy to jumpstart it, and then that has problems. So I don't know, but looking at the pace of change and the flow of money, I don't think it's going to be fast. And then there's long-term consequences, like when the schools were closed and all the girls are out of school, now a lot of those girls are pregnant, and that for those girls has pretty much set their future. They're definitely not back in school. So we have these long-term things and they're going to play out very differently than they would have, especially for girls and women. But I think it'll be a while.
Hi, Stephanie. This is Ernest from
Hi,
Nairobi,
Ernest.
Kenya.
Hi.
Hi. I have a question. Possibly it would have been interesting to hear more on the role of the county government, the national government, because I noticed your presentation is focused a lot on at household level, but these households live in a certain context. There is the county government, there's the national government, there are development partners that work in this space. Possibly you could have talked a bit more on their role. Was there any response? To get a better picture.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, we did I'll answer what I know about this, and then I'll turn to the qualitative team. We did ask in our surveys. We have great data that came from the PREG team and about systems level investments and where they're taking place at a sublocation level. We did ask about households' involvement, that piece of the county level. Are you aware that if there is a ward development management committee in your community? There was very little awareness on the household end. That doesn't mean that it's not operating and not effective. But I just want to say that that's what we see in the quantitative data, and anyone on the qualitative team who talked about the county level institutions, please add to this.
Yeah, thanks,
Yes.
Ernest. This is Hannah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Diana.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Ernest. And yeah, just to add to what Stephanie said, some counties reported having development committees from the county level, you know, where they had like the natural resource management have peace committees, natural resource management committees, or peace committees for pastoralist communities that were facing conflicts, or committees that were formed to discuss water issues, committees that were formed to discuss development issues from the ward level all the way up. But yeah, as Stephanie said, most of the households did not have quite an understanding of that. And most of these comments came from the focus group discussions that had members who were part of these committees participate in them. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. This is Mark Langworthy. I'm not on the qualitative team, but I think your question is a very good one, Ernest. And I think one of the things to say is that for this presentation, we have we're just in the interest of time, we haven't really looked at sort of the county level variations, but we certainly have that information, and that will be something that we will look at in the more in-depth analysis that we'll be conducting, after we have the fourth round. In terms of the descriptive information, we can provide it at the county level. Although, just in terms of the quantitative information, remember that our sample size is relatively small for this RMS study. But I think one of the things that we will definitely would like to get input from and information from partners that have more of an understanding of sort of what's happening on the ground, and particularly around the political realities and differences across counties in terms of the political situation. I think that that information will be very helpful for us to interpret the findings that we see now, and we'll be trying to uncover more, more carefully in the final analysis. But so I think any input that we can, anyone on the team or any sort of stakeholders in this process can give us about sort of what are the variations at the county level in terms of political or policy realities would be very helpful. Thanks. Over.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that feedback. Maybe just a follow-up question. When I look at your presentations, I'm just asking myself, what sort of a message or recommendations would this go to policymakers or development partners? Or what is this that can be done in a more sustainable way that will bring change?
This is Stephanie. I think that one of the things we would like to look at is to better understand the sort of trade-offs between humanitarian assistance and development funding or development programming. They both, it's my impression that humanitarian assistance is moving into the picture that has its own strengths and weaknesses. And in my view, this sort of resilience development programming builds resilience that lasts over several, statistically over several survey rounds, but over, 1 or 2 or 3 years. So, and cash assistance generally, unless it's enough for an investment, does not have that quality. So what we would like to do is understand the relative roles of those things. Another thing that can happen with cash assistance is if you give everyone money at the same time and there's a shortage of goods, prices will go up and they'll be pretty much exactly right where they were before. So, and we're also looking at the relationships between resilience capacities. For instance, when you build, something like a VSLA, also, there's evidence that VSLAs also build social capital. Social capital is one of the last resilience capacities to deteriorate in most of our studies in shocks. So we're looking at those kinds of trade-offs. And that another, this is an extremely complicated situation. Another issue is the issue of savings. It's difficult to recommend to people that they put money in a savings account in high inflation because the value of the money goes down. So this population is hit hard on both sides. The drought, as Mark, we're talking to Mark yesterday, the drought has wiped out their livestock and inflation has wiped out their savings. So it's, between a rock and a hard place for sure in what should happen. And anyone else's insights on that would be great.
Hi, yeah, this is Mark again. Yeah, I think one hypothesis that we are considering now, and I think we something we definitely want to try and analyze to have come up with some support or not for this hypothesis, but my sense is that when you have this, sort of very extreme and long-term exposure to severe shocks that pretty much wipe out household level resilience capacities. Think sort of basically in terms of livestock and household assets in agricultural production. That perhaps when we think about recovery from this kind of a situation, and the fact that perhaps these kinds of shocks are going to be ongoing, the important kind of resilience investment may be really more focused on systems level kinds of investment, and perhaps even more specifically on strengthening government capacities to be able to more effectively provide the kinds of emergency support when it's needed, and coordinate sort of activities, the switch from emergency response to more recovery and ultimately investment activities. But so that may be one, for now, that's sort of just a hypothesis really, but hoping we can tease out some findings from the analysis to address this. But it seems like perhaps in the reality that we're looking now in northern Kenya, as we think about sort of investment activities moving forward, the first step may be to really focus on, or maybe not the first step, but a high priority should be given to these systems level, and particularly these public or government service kinds of systems. Over.
Thank you, Mark. Any other questions, comments? Remember, you can use the reactions to raise your hand, or you can type your question in the chat, or observation or contribution to what the greater context is.
Maybe just to follow up on this discussion, one of the challenges we get is whatever hypothesis that we have, be it strengthening the government or creating savings groups, or the question is, where is the evidence that it is working? I don't know whether I could get that from this presentation. So that's why I raised that question. what is this that could be done in a more sustainable way based on your study that will really bring change. So maybe as you analyze your data, it will really help to see what is it that if that could really alleviate the situation.
Mhm.
And then also looking not just at the household level, because the household lives in a certain context. There is a county government, and we have the NGOs and development partners in this space. We have the national government. We have the private sector. We have, say, livestock markets in these areas. Have these markets collapsed, or are they still working? For us to understand the context in a much better way and see what is this, where are the opportunities that if investment is done in this area, then the situation will change. Thank you.
Okay, that's point is well taken. We do some sort of unofficial analyses as we're moving through this. I would, it's way too early to say that this indicates that, because it usually doesn't work out well when we do that. We're seeing some just in running like side tests, some evidence that systems level households who live in communities with more systems level investments do better, a little bit better off in terms of resilience capacities. It's no way formal, it's no way final, but it's pointing in the right direction. My sense is that the implementation is probably uneven in the sense that the ability of a county to manage all this is really varied, and by things like high employee turnover, that this recipient piece is incredibly varied. We can look much more closely at what's working. The next section, I talk about how we're measuring participation. It's all household data, but livestock markets are also in there. We want to make sure that we're picking up what matters and what's important to implementers. And if no one has any questions, I'll get onto that. We have an opportunity now to modify the round 4 survey. We have an opportunity now to modify the qualitative. Once those data are in, that's it. And if we don't measure these things correctly, it's going to be much harder to show and to understand what's going on. Okay. Close this. So we also measure resilience capacities. In the first round of the RMS, we measure all of the pieces, or all the elements, or all the capacities that go into the index. But because those don't change every 3 months, we measure them in the beginning and the end, and not as we go along. The things we do measure are social capital, which we have 2 ways of asking about social capital. One is whether households relied on and or shared with households in their communities, which is called bonding social capital, and emphasis is on actual sharing. Did you do this in the past, whatever time period? And bridging is, did you share with or give to households beyond your community? And then we have this sort of access or availability of social capital that goes into the resilience capacities. Something a household could draw on should they needed it. And it's always higher than actually used social capital. Households are, maybe it's speaking to optimism and generosity. It looks like the graph on the left that shows actual use, it is increasing. In many cases, the social capital piece, it takes the place or infills for programming. It's hard for me to imagine there is much more to share, but it increased in round 3 over round 2. We look at assets, and we continue to measure assets in every round as a pretty good indicator of what's going on, behind the scenes. And in these assets, the top line is livestock assets measured in tropical livestock units, which standardizes all the livestock to be in the same unit. Then is household assets, and at the bottom is productive assets. The livestock assets are clearly down. There's a slide after this about livestock. The household assets are down. These are small numbers, but they are significant, and productive assets are down. Household assets went up between the baseline and round one, which may be related to increased resilience capacity or increased, households generally being better off. What changed between the baseline and round one was households had more TVs, more radios, more cell phones, and more furniture. Then what went down in the later rounds is they kept their cell phones, but had fewer TVs, radios, and furniture. For productive assets, what we saw was a gradual decrease in small tools. Like it looked like small tools were wearing out and not being replaced. And this is consistent with qualitative data showing that households are leaving agriculture, at least for now. The livestock assets look not very good, but they're not as devastating as the qualitative reports. The graph on the left shows the percentage of households owning each kind of livestock, which has decreased significantly for all large livestock. And the graph on the right shows the mean number of livestock owned, which is pretty much plummeted. Even goats are down. Goats were through round two were fairly steady, but now there are people selling everything, and even goats are dying. As to livestock sales, they were higher in round three than one or two. The qualitative data say that all the livestock all the livestock markets were open and accessible in the past 3 months. We're seeing distressed sales. We track all the markets. The markets constructed under Regal consistently have made up about a third of the share of all sold livestock. So that those are sort of in lockstep with livestock sales. They haven't really gone up or down. Talk about interventions, and then we can look at this piece carefully. So we start with humanitarian assistance, which is not a development program, but it's affiliated, associated, and really important. What we saw in this round is that food aid was dropped way down, and it appears to be linked to household reports of delays in food aid. Whether that food aid has come in or not yet, I'm not sure, and I'm not sure whether it's tied to, are there actual global shortages, or is there just a hiccup in the delivery? Cash aid is up a lot, but it's incredibly unevenly distributed. The increases are all in Garissa and Mandera. No other counties reported any increase in cash aid. There's qualitative data show that WFP has started giving out emergency cash, but the households that have been targeted for emergency cash are the same that were receiving it as a monthly transfer. The high cost of food and fuel may be affecting food aid at the humanitarian assistance level. We don't know the answer to that. We would, compared to the number and the percentage of households that are reporting severe hunger and moderate and severe food insecurity, the cash and food aid rates are really low. Fodder, you notice, is down around 4%. Fodder is a PREG program. As an aside, fodder appears to help goat owners, but its distribution is so limited, which is one of the food aid, and comparing to development programming issues. Food aid or cash aid. Cash aid is easy to reach a lot of people quickly through electronic transfers. Fodder is geographically pretty localized, and animals are moving around. So there's a trade-off there that you need to be aware of. We had stories of, not quite sure if it's, but with cash aid, that some of it was running through banks, and that brick and mortar banks, and that recipients had to get to the bank, which was, several days away, and took almost all of their transfer money just to get to the bank. This follows on what we see in the quantitative data. Key informants reported that cash transfers were up, but in other counties, they reported that they had no emergency aid had come through in 3 months. The elections created another problem for deliveries. It was like another short shock. Politicians were giving out money to people and food. There are some stories that politicians were delivering cash aid. We're not sure what was actually going on. There was, in some counties, there was a violence associated with elections. Business owners are reluctant to be particularly active around election time, just because they don't want their businesses burned to the ground. So elections introduced their own short-term shock and disruption. So this is the summary of the PREG related program participation. And we refer to it as PREG related because we don't ask and we don't know whether households received programming from a PREG, a PREG program, or from another similar program. So they're all under the same umbrella, and we don't care if the program works. We're far less interested in who provided the funding than funding programs that work. So under these categories, we tallied whether households had received nutrition training, whether we have a module in the survey that asks about kinds of information a household receives. And because one of the key roles of these programs is providing information, we then created a variable if the household received that information and it came from a PREG kind of actor, like an NGO, like a local government, like over SMS. And so from that, we created a PREG information variable, and depending on what subject it fell under, we put it in one of these categories. Finance is the existence of lending programs, insurance programs, savings programs. Crop is a long list of crop training and crop practices. The regal livestock markets is a count. These are all dummy variables, whether the household participated in one of these kinds of programs at any time since the PREG programming started. Let me digress a little. And the way we measured it is in round one, we have a 3-year recall. So we, as best we could, we got people to think back 3 years to when PREG started and give us a count of anything any of this activity they had done since then. Subsequently in the surveys, we asked at 3-month intervals. So by round 3, if we add up all those numbers, we have an estimate of participation over the time period since PREG started. This is a count of yes, no, they participated in this kind of programming. You see on the very, very bottom is governance. That's where we asked about board development management committees and households' involvement in it. I think in and of itself, I don't think that's a problem. It may be the case that in counties or wards where the management committees are really active, you might expect to find more awareness. I don't know the answer to that, but by itself, I don't I don't think it's an issue. What we're interested in is which of the are these categories interesting for program people? Are they sufficient? We can arrange to meet later offline and look at the actual questions we ask. Do these percentages make sense? Does it look like, 30% or 28% of households have had some contact with health and nutrition programming, which is either training or information? Is this kind of a breakdown going to provide useful information to you? But we need to get this. Overall, it shows, let me go to the next one. Overall, we see that about 60% of households reported participating in at least one of these kinds of programs since PREG started. For humanitarian assistance, about 70% of households reported receiving at least one kind of humanitarian assistance. That one has a shorter recall over the past 12 months or 14 months. So this is really important to us as analysts. We hope to get some feedback on whether or not it's useful to you. We see in our qualitative that there is actually a lot of PREG-funded activity going on. NWIRI is doing nutrition programming, and NWIRI is doing a lot of small business programming. People are aware of it and are using it. The LMS under PREG is distributing subsidized livestock feed. These are the shocks that are showing through the crop production that people who produce crops are saying they're hit by massive input price increases besides the drought. Livestock, people have sold livestock. There appears to be no grazing management strategies in place, which is we would like your input on that. People have been feeding food to livestock that's not actually food. They've been feeding them pieces of cardboard and boxes. We see a declining participation in VSLAs. Men in some communities have been saying that they feel excluded from VSLAs. Part of the reason we think is that there's just not the funding has run out for VSLAs, and people have either not paid back their loans, or they've taken their savings out, or if they were doing VSLAs were doing inputs, the inputs, the seeds died and there are no crops. So to summarize, price shocks and drought continue to be the top shocks. The secondary shocks remain high, continue unabated. There's no end in sight. Even if there's rain, these secondary shocks are going to continue. This households' perceived severity is at its highest levels. Households are becoming more fatalistic and just feel like they have no agency in this. Food security is at its worst levels, and humanitarian assistance appears to be very, very slow to arrive, is unevenly distributed, and even across geography, it's only going in some counties, and among households, it does not appear to be reaching everyone it needs to. All of these are tied to global events, so that I don't think anyone knows or how the resolution to these global problems is going to trickle down to local areas. We're starting to see from the qualitative data that new kinds of conflict, that community members are fighting with herders, that neighbors are stealing from each other, and that livestock theft is on the rise. It's always been fairly high, it's on the rise. And that migration is in disarray, that people are moving all over and animal herds are getting each other sick and people are fighting along the way, and there are no resources anywhere, and there's no information about what people can expect at their destination. On the programming piece of 6 types of humanitarian assistance, 70% of households reported receiving at least one since December of 2021. Looking at the PREG related programming, out of 12 types, about 2/3 reported participating in at least one activity or program since 2018. And the average number of program types is 2. We did a really quick and dirty analysis. We did a t-test looking at any kind of association with program participation and higher resilience capacities, just to see. This is nowhere near a finding because it could go away. Doesn't control for other variables, but yes, households who report higher participation have higher resilience capacity scores. To do that, there are some pieces of programming that are also pieces of resilience capacities. We back those out of the calculating capacities and re-estimate it. It's hopeful. It's definitely not conclusive, but it's a better sign than no relationship. I think it's important that we understand going forward the trade-offs between humanitarian assistance and resilience programming, both in terms of reach and effects over time, and the sort of unintended consequences of both. There is no one program fits all. It's going to be we are complicated people. This is a complicated problem, and we will need to develop a complicated solution. The big global questions are whether or not and how humanitarian assistance is restricted by global funding and logistical constraints. Savings is, as a programming emphasis, is problematic because of high inflation. And the people in the ASOL region, in this area have just been slammed on both sides by drought, taking out their livestock, inflation, taking out their savings, and all the attendant diseases and livestock diseases and theft and conflict and stress. And it is it's kind of almost beyond words to describe it. Thank you. And I'd like to talk about the programming, but any comments people have on that set of findings or anything in the presentation are more than welcome.
I'll break the ice. Thanks again, Stephanie. I'm thinking that early on, the slides about declining household ownership of livestock would require some more unpacking. I mean, we think of building household assets as a source of resilience. So, and why do we say that? Because when times are rough, you can consume them or put them to use or sell them to somehow maintain your household's well-being, at least in the short term. And with the drought and availability of fodder and depleted grazing lands, etc., you would want fewer livestock. So, in fact, we talk about destocking as a good early action as a crisis builds. So, it's seeing fewer livestock is maybe it's a good thing. And it would be more if households are able to retain breeding stock, or if there's a program in place for recovery of herds after the drought has passed, these sorts of things. So just those questions.
Okay, yeah, those are very interesting. In the beginning, when the initial destocking should have happened, a lot markets were closed because of COVID. The destocking has been an ongoing issue. I would suspect that there was a delicate balance between lack of information, prices were before the livestock got really, really sick and were dying, and no one could ever believe that a drought would go this long. I don't think it could have been the case that prices were a little low in the markets. We were also for a long time seeing market closures here and there, but I think your point is well taken. Somebody who knows the market situation better than I do can respond to that.
I don't know the market situation better, but I think, John, another issue that has come up in our findings, which is a problem, which I think we don't have an answer right now, but certainly deserves further inquiry, is that the challenge now is that you have, on the one hand, drought and flooding, which destroys livestock and perhaps other kind of assets, physical assets. But then at the same time, you will have this inflation, which erodes any kind of holding the option of holding wealth in financial assets. So you've got sort of this double whammy where real assets are at risk from weather-related shocks, and then you have financial assets that are eroding in financial terms. So there's a lot of additional risks that are challenges to thinking about best strategies for holding wealth. Over.
Thanks, Mark. I just wanted to make sure, Anne Swindale, I saw your hand go up. Did you still have a question or?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I put it up and I put it down, but I'll speak. Thank you very much, Stephanie and team. This is really sombering presentations, but thanks for doing the research. On the surface, of finding that 66% of households have participated in at least one PREG-related intervention seems like a fairly promising one, but I think I understand from what you presented that those were likely to be predominantly in health and nutrition type of interventions or the receipt of humanitarian assistance. But as I just said, that maybe not, because you did say specifically you were not considering humanitarian assistance as a PREG type intervention. That's correct, right? You can just nod your head.
That's correct. That's correct.
Because I can see you.
But it does have health and nutrition in there for sure.
Okay. Am I correct in thinking that what's driving a lot of the 66% is health and nutrition program participation?
I think in terms of pure counts, yes, but I think in terms of sort of actual transactions, I think it might be the Regal Markets, because it's just a count of, did you ever use it? But there's, over time, people sell a goat, sell a cow, sell a camel. So I think it is markets are going to emerge, which I hope. Can you speak a little more about any issues you see with health and nutrition? And why you're asking, why you're bringing this up?
I don't see any issues with it so much. Just that having, I think, a really good understanding about participation in the other types of interventions that are aiming to build resilience from a household economic perspective. Obviously, building resilience through the health and nutrition perspective is incredibly important, but getting an idea of what that the degree of participation in those kinds of interventions is, and if and this would be a question I think more for our Kenya colleagues, but if participation is still low in some of these key types of interventions, or let me change that question a little bit. Do you take away from these data that participation is still problematically low in some of your interventions? And if so, do you have any thoughts about what kinds of adaptations you might need to make to increase participation? That's question one. The other question is, this is reminding me a little bit about the findings from the PRIME Ethiopia impact evaluation as well, where you may have seen some impacts of participation in the resilience interventions, but the magnitudes of the shocks were just simply so great, they overwhelmed any potential effects that the interventions may have had. And so my second question is, it sounds like we may very well be in a similar situation here in northern Kenya. Are we going to be in a place where we're not really going to be able to distinguish whether the interventions had any positive impacts or not, because the shocks have been so overwhelming that any positive impacts that they might have had will be completely washed out by the severity of the shocks?
I'll start with your second question first. I think that what we can estimate, clearly the shocks have wiped out everything. It's what we can tell is sort of a relative well-off. Nobody's very well off, but there are people who engaged in PREG-related programming are less worse off than they would have been, which then leads to maybe, you know, if we can start to see recovery, then we can look at if PREG is important for recovery. If they didn't go down quite as low, maybe they'll bounce back faster. I think that's the best we can do there. If in the end nobody ever reports any recovery, then what you say is absolutely true. Like, it didn't matter. Nobody recovered no matter what. I mean, maybe it delayed their agonizing moment of losing their last livestock. But this I really don't know. This situation, I think, for everyone is just beyond the pale. It's 10 times worse than in the PRIME study. And I don't know, but we're hoping that for some households, we can try to find some positive deviants and look at them and see what is working. But I think the best we'll be able to do is to show a less of a fall for households in PREG-related programming. And it also, at the community level, it also looks like, in my senses, there are some places where not only is there a lot of programming, but it seems to be up and running and working well, which may be both a testimony to the programming, but also to things like leadership and community's ability to work together. So we can look at things like that. We are going to be responsible for finding something to help. I mean, we can't just stand by and watch this go on and not learn anything from it. And as far as participation, are you asking whether measuring participation is low or actual participation is low?
Actual.
I would say it would say that's a question for our Kenya colleagues. Do these numbers look low? I would think it would be both information and I think two things. Looking at the list, there was the girls program, which was by all qualitative measures successful, but did not reach a lot of girls. So it would be an issue of program expansion for some of these that are small-ish. And for other ones, it's an information issue. I think a lot of the participation is down because of the drought. People are not going to learn how to, plant something right now. They're not really in the mood, for lack of a better word. So I think a combination of better information and expanding these small programs that appear to be effective.
Thanks. Kenya colleagues, do you have anything to add?
Yes, Jamie.
I don't have anything to add because I'm not a Kenya colleague, but I did have a related question. So if I understand correctly, the participation data is gathered by asking households if they've received, some kind of intervention that is in those categories. I recognize that you were doing that so you didn't have to track it specifically to a particular Dennett funded activity, but I'm just wondering if you've ever tried to cross-check it with partner roles of households that they've reached, right? So they target, they keep records of who they are targeting, presumably. And so just wondering if it's a measurement issue because you're relying on people to recall if they've gotten an intervention, and if they're in the throes of a very severe shock, perhaps that's all they're thinking about and not so much about what they've gotten in the past versus like triangulating it a bit with some other data.
That's interesting. No, we did not do that. We could try to do that and at least spot check it without, we wouldn't have to do 100% of them, but just see, especially the ones that look low.
Well, sorry, I think there are a couple ways that we have other ways, other information for cross-checking. One is that the selection of the sublocations for the baseline, and then also for the sublocations that were chosen for the RMS study, was based on information that we received about activities, PREG activities with it that were undertaken within those sublocations. So there is that level of information that we actually used, you know, as part of our selection process. So we do have that information about PREG activities at the level of those sublocations. And then also we do in the qualitative component, we do get information about the kinds of activities that are being undertaken within those communities. So we do have some information to cross-check that over.
And the other thing was we don't ask where, I mean, we could go further down that road, but we don't ask the donor agency. So we, but what you say is true. If USAID or if PREG is doing something and we're not showing it, then that's what we're after. We're not after a complete accounting. So, okay, I understand better now.
Sorry to pick on you, Jim, but I saw your hand also go up and down. Do you have something to share? So,
Well,
okay, if you.
No, I mean, just to the point in terms of looking back at county and some of the systems that are there, I think looking historically, knowing that all of the PREG related counties, they have new leadership into it moving forward, it would also be good to, and it won't be for as long as RMS goes, but to continue to track as these people come on boarding. And even as part of RLA's role in the Secretariat is to, cross-check in terms of the level of investment too. And that might be something we can add on to RMS to look at return of investment or further deep dive into some of these activities. It's clear the crop markets, what Regal LMS has been doing, the Nawiri program, some of the others with WFP, which does crop and a lot of cash relief program. I think as we get further into these new governors and county officials, I think it would be good one to see that change over a little bit more time, but also to see if the service delivery mechanisms pick up entering the new calendar year as these new county officials come into work and they've outlined the manifestos and they're trying to move money through the planning and budgeting. So that's just something to keep an eye on moving forward, noting the elections did create a stagnation during part of this period too as well.
Thank you, Jim. John, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Tom asked in the chat for ideas about future rounds. And I don't know if this goes into that category, but somehow it seems like the adaptation part might not be getting pulled out as much or enough focus. I'm thinking of some of the questions asked of our administrator when she toured the area and other reflections that this has been the way of life for so long, but given the severity and frequency of the droughts and the inadequate periods between droughts for the herds to recuperate and the rangelands to recuperate, is this still viable? And maybe it's not the end of pastoralism for sure, but I'm sure that policymakers and households are thinking, what else can we do? How else can we survive in this environment? And that's adaptation.
Yeah.
And we touch upon it, I think, in terms of the capacities, but the actions of people would be and systems would be interesting to know more about, I think. Thanks.
Yeah, that's interesting. And one of the things we could do along those lines, which is a small piece of it, is we can model out migration. We have people who were there for round one and left, and see who's leaving and try to get some sort of handle on it. We have some data about livelihoods, but I think that's a really important piece. And I think we can go pretty far with the data that we have to looking into that, and at least generate some qualitative questions for a follow-up without having to do a big project.
Hi, this is Lori in the Center for Resilience. Just to jump in on that particular piece, I think during the last, the last time we met, maybe after round two, we had a similar conversation about migration and really trying to understand a bit more about when people migrate, what are the outcomes of that migration. And I was noticing that in terms of the remittances, we're not seeing any increase in remittances. So it seems like in terms of the impact so far, when people are migrating, it's not really resulting in increased remittances, at least that we can see. But, recognizing that it can take time to get settled and all of that, I think that'd be certainly an interesting area of inquiry, whether or not we have the sort of resources and capacity to follow it up or not, I guess is another question.
Yeah, that's interesting to put remittance, a little bit better remittance collection in round four. Remittances are sometimes tricky. People don't always want to admit or talk about receiving remittances, but we can we'll get it at it as best we can. That's a good question. Thank you.
And just a reminder that we're also monitoring the chat and the Google Doc in case you would prefer to type out your observations, questions.
And you know where to find us if you have a middle of the night question you need to ask about the RMS surveys.
Stephanie,
Mm-hmm.
did you look at realized resilience and take a look at any households, if maybe there were none given the situation, but from round one to round two and round two to round three that were able to recover or even end up in a better situation in your analyses, or was that just
We have not,
even a
but we
thing?
will. Yeah. Sorry to
Oh, you
interrupt.
haven't looked
We
at it
have
yet.
not, but we will. And that's a great question. And that's
Okay.
yeah. And I like doing all these little sort of see where we're going. I'm not optimistic.
Yeah, me neither.
I think that we will see, so few that we can't say anything about them.
Mm-hmm.
And my hunch, when we ask people, they say, oh yeah, they're the people with salary jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're seeing, which is interesting, is we're not seeing livelihood diversification. We're seeing people jumping out of their traditional, their standard livelihoods and desperately seeking money. So it's not diversification as we conceptualize it.
Right.
And I see that Jeannie has hand up.
Yeah, I think I was going to ask the same thing, probably not using the right terminology for it, but it would be useful to the extent that the data allows for this type of analysis. And that depends on your numbers, to get a sense of less about recovery from the ones. I mean, we're in a pretty unprecedented situation with just the repeated failed rains and then the global price shock that's happened in inflation. But to get a sense of is there a lag and sort of households doing a bit better off. Everybody's on a downward track, but I mean that while it's not the success we want to see, it is actually a positive thing that resilience programming helps to buffer to a certain extent, recognizing that lots of everybody's being overcome at this point.
Right. We hope some households will come back faster resilience program will help them, hopefully.
Yeah, or even if it slows the downward trajectory.
Right.
You know, I mean, it's not always about the
Right.
immediate recovery. It's more allowing you time to, if we have a future scenario where there's not 4 shocks in a row,
Right.
you know, back to back to back.
And one thing that this study, these REGAL/PREG studies are allowing us to do, it was a comment, maybe it was John Meyer, it came up in an earlier presentation, was a better understanding of how the relationship among shocks, like if you consider drought to be the initial shock and the secondary or downstream shocks come from that drought, what does that look like? What's the timing? What's the lag? How does that whole shock system work? So I think I think one of the contributions we can make from this data is a better understanding of that. And hopefully that will feed into again, to better programming to deal with shocks and what to anticipate when. If it wasn't so grim, it would be very exciting.
Mhm.
I think on our end, we can do the wrap up as mentioned. If there's any other questions or follow up, please feel free to reach out to RLA or directly also with the RMS team in terms of that. I think as we continue to move forward with the new county governments and as RLA continues to look at the PREG, we'll also keep an eye on best practices or stories to make sure we're amplifying, but also sharing with them to see if what we're seeing in the fields continues to validate or what is observational versus what we're seeing in terms of the trend lines regarding the ongoing research to that. I want to thank everyone for their time and participation today. And as mentioned, we'll let you get a few minutes back to your day unless there's any other final questions, comments, or concerns.
I see one comment in the chat asking about what the next steps and timing is for finalizing this analysis.
We have a round 4 coming up in January, and then we start doing the final analysis. And we'll work on a strategy for releasing results in a timely manner, not in a protracted drought-like research state.
Yeah, I just to follow up on that, I think what we would propose to do is we would have a similar presentation like this, where we would give the descriptive findings from the round 4, in a timely way, and then the analysis, which would be where we would be addressing a lot of these questions that came up today, where we are going to do analysis to try to answer some of those questions. That would be a bit later. I think that would be our proposed strategy for providing the information. Over.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you all for joining us. If you have a moment, I've posted a link to a survey in the chat. If you could fill that out, that'll help us out with future events. But thank you all for participating. Thank you, Stephanie and Mark, for this great presentation. And we hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.